speaking on fighting the EDL, the English Defence League, neo-Nazi organization in England, and fascism in Britain.
Well, again, thanks for inviting me to speak. I had something prepared, but I want to respond to some of the things that have been said, if that's okay, because I think it's a really interesting discussion. At the moment in Britain, you have two kinds of far-right organisations. What the comrade just described, the BNP, the British National Party, which turn towards electoral politics and turn towards respectability. And then you also have a more kind of street-fighting organisation, the English Defence League, although it has a Scottish branch, which I mainly deal with, the Scottish Defence League. Both of those organisations have put forward quite similar politics in a way, but they're tactically very different. And I think that the point that the comrade just made about why is it that these organisations have a certain echo amongst working class people, I think that's an important discussion, because the BNP, when it made electoral gains over the last 10 years, attracted a Labour vote, an ex-Labour vote, a working class vote. The EDL, although it doesn't stand in elections, its composition, although its leadership is quite middle class, its composition is mainly football casuals, working class young people. So why is that the case? And I think the main reason is because of the lack of faith, the lack of faith in the main political party in Britain, the ex-Workers' Party, the Labour Party, which was founded by the trade unions and has now moved to the right. And I think that there's a huge disenfranchisement. It's lost nearly 5 million votes of working class people. And there's a certain vacuum that exists in Britain, but probably elsewhere in Europe as well, when the ex-social democratic parties have moved to the right, and there's a vacuum in politics. The BNP and the EDL, interestingly, are in crisis at the moment. They made gains electorally in terms of the BNP, who won councillors on a local level, and they won a couple of MPs in the European Parliament. By the way, in the European elections, it's very likely the BNP will be wiped out electorally in terms of the European Parliament. They've lost almost all of their councillors in England. And that's the experience of them being in power, because in power they acted just like the rest of the party. They put forward austerity policies. In the case of the European Parliament, they probably didn't even turn up to the meetings. So people have seen them for who they are. There is a certain electoral attraction now in England, especially towards the UK Independence Party, which is a right populist Eurosceptic party that puts forward a racist position, an overtly racist position on immigration. You wouldn't describe it as fascist, but it is a right populist party, probably with some far-right elements. And again, that process I described before, of the working class being disenfranchised, feeds into the question of UKIP as well. And I think we're dealing with two issues here. We need to mobilise to confront the far right. We need to build mass campaigns to confront the far right. We need to organise workers and young people through the trade unions, but also in communities against the far right, and stop the far right organising in our areas. But we also need to have, I think, a political strategy for dealing with the far right. And I think Yanis hit the nail on the head in his introduction. It needs to be linked to fighting austerity. We need to be talking about a united struggle for jobs, for houses, for wage increases for working class people as well. And personally, as a socialist, I think we need to put forward the idea of new workers' parties. Not just to fight elections, by the way, but because I think that's one of the problems in France, but also to actually be street fighting organisations in the sense of organising working class people to fight back against austerity. The comrade from Turkey made some very important points, I think, about how the capitalist class in Europe are turning towards more authoritarian measures to try and fight back against the resistance to austerity. There's been a huge scandal in Britain at the moment, actually, with the revelation that in the 90s, undercover police officers were sent into the anti-racist movement to try and discredit anti-racist campaigns. There were racist murders, the Stephen Lawrence murder in the early 90s, which was a huge issue in Britain. And there was a mass campaign that developed after that event where the BNP's headquarters was shut down in Welling by a mass demonstration. But the police in Britain infiltrated the organisations that came together, the United Front that came together to build for that demonstration in Welling, and it's been revealed recently. And I think that's what we have to be very wary as a kind of as an anti-fascist movement, as a working class movement, that the capitalists will use authoritarian measures. And I think just in the same way you've seen brutal police methods used against protesters, against austerity across Europe. Similar methods are now being used or being discussed in Britain. The use of water cannons, which have obviously been used in Istanbul and in Greece as well against protesters. But I think the question that was raised about what kind of situation are we in? I don't think we're in the 1930s. I don't think we're in a position where we're going to see the rise of a classical mass movement of fascism. I think it's a different political situation. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take the far right and fascists seriously. We should take them absolutely seriously. But what's happened just in Sweden in the last week with 7 anti-fascist socialist activists being attacked and stabbed on the streets of Sweden. We've seen a mass mobilisation of workers and young people against those attacks. We need to take the far right extremely seriously, and we need to be conscious that the capitalists will use the far right. Maybe they don't want the far right to come to power. Maybe that would be too unstable in terms of what happened before with Germany and with Italy. But the far right are useful for the capitalists. The fascists are useful as a battering ram against our movements and to try and divide us in terms of the struggles that we face as workers and as young people. And I think it's extremely important that we have an international focus to this discussion, because there is, as well as the rise of nationalism and the rise of fascism and the rise of racism and anti-immigrant ideas, there's also an internationalist consciousness that's developing amongst working class and young people. And we need to make sure that we have meetings like this, and I think it's extremely a good initiative that the comrades have taken, in the sense that the comrade at the end of the table talked about an international organisation. We don't have any faith in their institutions. We don't have any faith in the EU and to solve the problems of nationalism and racism in Europe. But the only international organisation that can solve the question of racism and nationalism and inequality is the working class across Europe and across the world, in terms of the US as well. And I think that workers and young people have been inspired by the fight back against austerity, by the general strikes that have taken place endlessly in Greece, where there's probably over 20 general strikes, in Spain, in Portugal, and in other countries. In Britain, we're still fighting for a general strike. We're begging the trade union leaders, we're saying to the trade union leaders, bring us out onto the streets to fight back against austerity, and they're not willing to lead the struggle. And I think that's one of the reasons as well why there's a currency for far-right ideas. There's a frustration that develops, perhaps particularly amongst young people, who maybe have an anti-party mood of, how can we defeat austerity? And if the trade unions don't fight back, and if there aren't political parties for young people to join that are fighting back effectively, then there's no wonder that these organisations gain a certain currency. So in the city that I live in, Glasgow, there's going to be a demonstration on the 22nd of March, just like elsewhere in the world. But I think it's important that we do have a focused discussion. I think it's important that we build the biggest mobilisations possible. There are comrades from different political traditions on this platform, and no doubt in this room. We should follow the policy of the United Front, where we act together against the far right and against fascists, but we also have debates and discussions like this where we discuss different issues. I just want to say one thing about the national question. I thought James made some excellent points on the Ukraine. I come from a country, Scotland, which has a national question, not quite as explosive as the Ukraine at the moment. But there's two elements to the national question. There's their nationalism, where they want to divide working class people. But there's also perhaps workers and young people that look towards a national solution to the crisis that they face in their everyday lives. And in Scotland, there's the question of independence, and young people looking towards independence as a solution against austerity, but perhaps in Spain with the issue of Catalonia as well. And I think that's important to understand that there's different kinds of nationalism, and we need to try and intervene in the nationalist movements in some of these countries and put forward socialist ideas and win people to the left. But that also means, in the case of Ukraine and in the case of Scotland, defending people's democratic rights if they want to call for a separation. And I think that's critical as well. And I just wanted to finish on this point about the EU, which I think it is an important issue, because I think working class people in Europe would be sympathetic, and young people are sympathetic to the idea of the political unity of Europe. But in reality, the EU is a boss's club. That's what it is. It's a mechanism for which they enforce austerity. And I think it's important in the European elections that are coming up that in every country that we have pro-working class candidates standing up, that we have strong socialist campaigns that stand up against the main capitalist parties in the European Parliament and put forward an alternative. And of course, within the EU, we don't just say, the EU is not a solution, we want to leave the EU, but on the basis of building a socialist society, because that's the only alternative, really, in terms of getting rid of the scourge of racism, of fascism, and of right-wing nationalism forever from society. So I'm finished there.